In the scorched backlands of Alabama, 1838, the Hammond plantation was known for two things: cotton that grew tall as a man's chest, and punishment that could break a soul. Overseer Harlan Briggs carried a whip braided with wire, and Master Elijah Hammond believed obedience was measured in silence. He delighted in taking voices from those who dared speak truths he did not want to hear. But among the enslaved was a young man named Jonas, born with a quiet strength and a way of speaking that made people stop and listen. He had a voice smooth as river stones, a tongue sharpened by scripture and by stories carried across the ocean. The others said God had set a coal of fire in his mouth. He could calm a fight, expose a lie, or shame a master without raising his tone. Elijah Hammond hated him for it. A slave was supposed to bow his head, but Jonas bowed to no lie. Even beaten, even starved, he had a way of standing that made others stand straighter. The mistress often sent for him to read to her. His voice soothed her. Elijah thought it infected the house with ideas: dignity, truth, rebellion. One humid night, after a day of backbreaking picking, Elijah ordered Jonas dragged to the smokehouse. The men were forced to hold him down as the master took a hooked blade and did what he did to livestock that brayed too loud. He cut out Jonas's tongue. Everyone thought Jonas would never speak again. But by dawn, it was not Jonas's tongue nailed to the Hammond barn door. It was Elijah Hammond's, and the blood that dripped down the wood spelled a message none of them ever forgot. The August heat came down like punishment. Jonas moved along the row with hands trembling from exhaustion, the burlap sack dragging behind him like a dead limb. His tongue still worked than his last day with it. He whispered psalms under his breath as a way to keep the sun from burning through his mind. Hush that noise. Briggs had barked earlier, though Jonas had barely whispered. Briggs hated anything that sounded like hope, but Jonas could not help the way verses rose inside him. Words had saved him his whole life. Words had given him a spine when the world tried to fold him. At midday, a young boy named Carter stumbled and spilled half his sack. Briggs rode over on his mule, whip already raised. Jonas stepped between them before he even thought. "Sir," he said softly, "the boy's sick with heat. Let him rest a minute." Briggs froze. No slave spoke that calmly, not to him. Not ever. "You watch your mouth," Briggs growled. Jonas did not back down. "I'm only speaking truth." And that was all it took. By sundown, the whole plantation hummed with rumor. Mistress and had been crying. The field hands kept glancing toward the big house. Everyone felt the storm gathering around Jonas, but he kept moving through the rows as if nothing were shifting. Just before dinner, two overseers approached. "Master wants you," one said. Jonas knew. His stomach sank, but his spine stayed straight. They dragged him across the yard, past the cookhouse, past the quarters where everyone watched through cracks in the wood. No one dare breathe. Inside the smokehouse, Elijah Hammond stood waiting with a lantern and a table of tools: hooks, knives, branding irons. "You think your tongue belongs to you," Elijah said, stepping closer. "It belongs to me." Jonas met his eyes. Even then, seconds from horror, he did not lower his gaze. And that look, that steady, unafraid look, broke something inside Elijah. "Hold him." They forced him to his knees. Jonas felt their hands like iron clamps, felt the hook in his jaw, felt the blade. He did not scream. The pain was white, blinding, endless. But he did not give Elijah that satisfaction. When it was done, Elijah dropped the small, bloody piece of flesh on the dirt like a scrap of meat. He wiped his blade as if nothing sacred had been taken. "Now," Elijah said, "let's see you talk." Jonas fell sideways, clutching his throat as blood filled his mouth. The world swayed. The overseers walked out laughing. Elijah left the lantern burning and locked the door. Jonas lay alone in the smokehouse, shivering though the night was hot, staring at the ceiling beams through a haze of pain. His heartbeat slowed, his breath grew shallow. But then something ancient opened inside him, a place deeper than flesh, deeper than speech. A voice not made of tongue or sound, but rage and memory, and the weight of every ancestor who had ever been stolen, beaten, silenced. He could not speak, but the world around him heard. And miles away on the far end of the cotton fields, The hounds began howling because something was walking through the dark toward the Hammond house, something carrying vengeance in its hands, something that had heard Jonas's silence and answered it. By dawn, Elijah Hammond's tongue, ripped clean from his own mouth, was nailed into the barn door with a blacksmith spike. Below it, smeared in blood, were 3 words, "Let him speak." Hours passed after the brutal punishment, and the barn stood silent, save for the wind rattling through the timbers. Jonas, the young slave whose tongue had been cruelly cut, huddled in the corner, the pain radiating through his mouth and throat. Blood had dried in sticky patches on his lips, and he could only manage muffled breaths. But his eyes burned with something far sharper than any blade, a fire that refused to die. He listened as Master Hammond paced outside the cabin, muttering curses, his bootsteps heavy and full of self-assured menace. The men who had carried out the act had long since returned to their quarters, leaving the master alone with his own arrogance. They believed silence would keep him in power. But Jonas's mind was already turning, plotting in the shadows of his suffering. By nightfall, the moon hung low over the fields, and the barn shadows seemed to twist and breathe. Jonas, sensing the faint sounds of the master's restlessness, forced himself to crawl toward the loft, every movement a labor of willpower. He had memorized the ropes, the loose boards, the gaps between the planks. Each inch brought him closer to tools he had noticed lying forgotten from the carpenter's bench. Though his tongue was gone, his hands could speak volumes, and they moved with precision, born of desperation and rage. Outside, Master Hammond had grown restless, peering through the barn windows, unaware of the plan fermenting inside. He had never considered that the one he'd mutilated could hold the power to turn the tables, nor that vengeance could be silent yet absolute. Jonas found the hammer slick with old oil and a length of rope. He tied it with the skill he had learned watching the overseers and farmers handle horses and livestock. Then, with careful patience, he threaded the rope through a crevice in the barn ceiling, testing its weight and strength. Each moment, each breath drew him closer to the reckoning that would come under the cover of night, when the master's arrogance would meet the precision of a man who had nothing left to lose but his silence. Hours later, as the master wandered near the barn, thinking the night too dark for harm, Jonas positioned himself near the loft hatch. The rope swayed gently above, a quiet sentinel of vengeance. Jonas's eyes, dark with determination, reflected the lantern light that flickered from the master's cabin. One final breath, a prayer to no God but justice, and the barn would witness the reversal of cruelty, a punishment measured in the currency of fear, a lesson carved into history in the stillness of that night. The night was thick, the air tense, and the barn waited, and Jonas, though voiceless, would soon speak with the weight of every moment of suffering inflicted upon him. The sun had barely risen over the sprawling fields of the Hammond estate when whispers of the previous night's horror began to circulate among the remaining slaves. A thin mist hovered over the barn, curling around the wooden beams and leaving everything damp with the scent of fear and decay. Elijah Hammond, unaware of what was coming, stepped out of the manor house in his crisp morning coat, expecting the usual quiet servitude from his workers. Instead, the air was thick with unease. He first noticed the stillness. Not a single bird dared to sing. Even the horses seemed to sense something was wrong, stamping nervously and snorting into the mist. Then he saw it. The barn door, usually solid and locked tight, had a new addition, a crude wooden board nailed haphazardly across the top half, with something dark and glistening impaled upon it. Elijah's heart froze as he recognized the form. It was a tongue, unmistakably human, nailed in place with small iron spikes. The realization struck him in a wave of panic. He staggered back, his mind struggling to comprehend. This was his own tongue, the very organ he had used to bark orders, to curse and humiliate the slaves, now displayed in grotesque mockery for all to see. Voices, soft but sharp, began to echo from the shadows of the barn. At first, Elijah thought it was his imagination, a hallucination born of fear. But as the whispers grew, he discerned a rhythm, a cadence, as if someone or many someones were speaking directly to him. Every word you've spoken, every command you've barked, we heard, came a thin, melodic voice. Then another joined in, deeper and harsher, layering over the first. Every insult, every strike we remember. Elijah's knees gave way, and he collapsed onto the dew-soaked grass, eyes fixed on the barn door. He realized then that the night's events were not a simple act of revenge. They were a message, a warning that the balance had shifted. That power, however entrenched, could be overturned. Inside the barn, the slaves moved silently, shadows among shadows. Their leader, a tall, gaunt figure known among the fields as Elias, had orchestrated this terrifying tableau. His hands, steady and precise, had carried out the act with meticulous care. Each nail, each placement, was meant to evoke fear, but also respect, a lesson that cruelty begets cruelty. Elijah struggled to speak, his voice caught in his throat. Who? Who did this? He whispered, his words trembling. Elias stepped into the light, filtering through the cracks in the barn walls. His face was calm, almost serene, belying the wrath that had fueled the act. We did, he said simply. You cut out one of us. Now one of you is silenced forever. Let it be a reminder of what you've sown. The other slaves emerged from the shadows, each carrying tools, implements, or items symbolizing the daily cruelties they had endured. They arranged themselves around the barn door, silent but commanding, their presence heavy with unspoken menace. Elijah tried to move, tried to reach the door, but fear rooted him in place. He understood then that the slaves had claimed not just vengeance, but dominance over the space he had once considered entirely his. Every glance, every subtle movement communicated a singular truth. The hierarchy had shifted. As the sun climbed higher, the barn and its surroundings were transformed, no longer merely a place of labor and suffering. The site had become a monument to resistance, a monument to the fact that the oppressed could strike back and that retribution could be orchestrated with precision and inevitability. The day stretched on, and Elijah remained by the barn, frozen in horror and awe. He realized that words, once his instrument of control, had been turned against him. And as the slaves dispersed silently back into their daily routines, Elijah understood that the events of that night, the nailing of his tongue to the barn door, would haunt him forever. Every command he attempted to give, every plea or argument would be weighed against the terrifying spectacle and the quiet, patient wrath of those he had sought to dominate. For Elias and his comrades, the act was not simply revenge. It was justice wrought in silence and precision. And as they moved into the shadows of the fields, the barn stood as a testament to the power of those who had been underestimated, whose patience had been long, and whose retaliation was finally complete. Elijah Hammond, tongueless and broken, would never speak without the shadow of that night looming over him, a constant reminder that cruelty can ignite vengeance beyond imagination, and that power is never absolute when wielded without justice. The morning after the barn door incident, a thick silence hung over the Hammond estate. The usual bustle of the fields was subdued. Even the animals moved cautiously, as though aware that the balance of power had shifted overnight. Elijah Hammond, still reeling from the horror of finding his tongue nailed to the barn door, attempted to rally his household, but his commands were stifled by fear, and the servants and overseers looked at him with a new weariness, unsure how to act in the face of what had occurred. Inside the great house, Elijah's wife, Lillian, paced nervously in the parlor. Her skirts rustled like dry leaves as she fretted over the scandal that would inevitably spread through the county. "Elijah," she said, voice quivering, "what are we going to do? This is monstrous. The slaves have gone too far. We must call the militia. We must punish them." Elijah's hands shook, unconsciously curling into fists. But he knew that calling the militia would not undo the humiliation. It might only escalate it. "We have to be careful, Lillian," he said, voice cracked. "They're organized. Someone orchestrated this with precision. If we act rashly, it could cost more than just our pride." Meanwhile, outside, the slaves moved with quiet deliberation. Elias walked through the fields, observing his comrades as they worked. Their eyes were calm, almost serene, but underneath there was a simmering tension, a readiness for whatever might come next. They spoke in whispers, each message precise, ensuring no overseer or neighbor could overhear. "What's our next step?" asked a young woman, a weaver named Mariah, as she tended to the cotton rows. Elias glanced over her shoulder, eyes scanning the horizon. "We wait. We make them uneasy. Let them see that what happened in the barn is only the beginning. Let them fear the consequences of their cruelty." Back in the manor house, Elijah tried to regain some semblance of control. He called his overseers to him, his face pale and rigid with the strain of sleepless nights. "You will patrol the fields more closely," he said, though the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "No one leaves the plantation without my knowledge. I will not allow this to happen again." The overseers, men who had once barked orders at the slaves with unquestioned authority, now shifted nervously in their boots. Some exchanged furtive glances, realizing that the fear that had once belonged solely to the slaves was now shared by them as well. In the shadows of the trees lining the property, Elias observed the gathering from afar. He noted every movement, every hesitated gesture. The slaves had learned that psychological control could be as powerful as physical retaliation. Their silent presence in the fields, their careful positioning, and the memory of the barn door incident were now weapons in their hands. As the day progressed, small incidents began to ripple through the plantation. Tools went missing, fences were found subtly loosened, and animals were mysteriously spooked. The message was clear. The slaves were asserting their autonomy, and they were willing to act in ways that struck fear without direct confrontation. By evening, the manor house was shrouded in unease. Elijah and Lillian sat in their parlor, listening to the distant sounds of the fields. The usual clatter of work had been replaced with an eerie quiet, punctuated by the occasional whisper of movement or a rustle in the trees. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. Elias returned to the barn at dusk, inspecting the nails that had held Elijah's tongue. The iron spikes were dark and weathered, a silent reminder of the message they had sent. He ran his fingers over the rough wood, ensuring no trace of the act remained that could implicate any one person too directly. Precision, he reminded himself, was key. The goal was to maintain the balance of fear without unnecessary exposure. Night fell over the plantation, and a heavy fog rolled in from the surrounding woods. The Hammonds retired to their rooms, uneasy and restless, while the slaves continued to move silently through the shadows. The lessons of the barn door were now etched into every part of the estate. Elijah's authority had been shattered, replaced with a sense of vulnerability he had never known, and the slaves moved with the confidence of those who had taken back a measure of power they had long been denied. As Elias returned to the quarters, he whispered to his people, "Tonight we rest. Tomorrow we watch. Remember the lesson of the barn. Fear is a tool, and it can be wielded without a single word." And with that, the estate fell into a tense, watchful quiet. The echoes of the past night's terror lingered in every corner, a shadow over the Hammonds, a reminder that their control was no longer absolute, and that the slaves, patient and cunning, held the means to reshape the order of their world. Dawn broke over the Hammond plantation with an unusual stillness. The birds did not sing as they normally did. The usual chatter of workers in the fields was subdued, replaced with the soft, deliberate movements of those who knew the night had changed everything. Elijah Hammond had hardly slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind through the eaves, seemed to whisper reminders of his impotence. He paced the upper hallway, fists clenched, repeatedly glancing out the windows toward the fields, where shadows shifted in ways that made him startle. Lillian sat stiffly on a chaise, her fingers entwined tightly, nails digging into her palms. "They're everywhere," she murmured. "I can feel them watching us." Elijah swallowed hard. "Yes, and we cannot even call the militia without exposing ourselves. If the neighbors find out what happened, if they hear the story." His voice trailed off, the words failing him. Meanwhile, Elias moved among the slaves, issuing silent instructions. Each one had a role. Some watched the manor. Others prepared small but precise acts to remind the Hammonds of the night's lesson. A broken wheel here, a misaligned fence there. Nothing overtly dangerous, but enough to unsettle. By midday, Elijah sent the overseers to check on the fences and livestock. But as they moved through the fields, they discovered subtle sabotage. Ropes tied loosely, water troughs emptied, and paths blocked by hidden debris. Each incident was a whisper, a reminder that the slaves were no longer under complete control. Panic began to gnaw at the overseers. The fear that had once resided solely in the field now infected every corner of the plantation hierarchy. In the kitchen, Mariah quietly poured a small quantity of pepper into the master's midday meal. It was subtle, barely detectable, but Elijah's reaction was immediate. A sudden, violent cough escaped him, sending Lillian shrieking. The moment was small, yet symbolic. The balance of power had shifted, and the slaves knew it. As evening approached, Elias gathered the group. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the fields, and the Hammonds retired to their rooms earlier than usual. Elias addressed his companions in a hushed, urgent voice. A subtle signal passed between him and a group of workers in the distance, a nod, a slight wave of the hand. Within minutes, small but precise disruptions began to ripple across the property. A cow nudged into a fence post. A stack of hay slightly toppled. A water trough tipped just enough to spill its contents. Elijah and Lillian watched in mounting alarm as the day unfolded. No one could explain the sequence of minor catastrophes, and each event chipped away at their composure. Their fear had become tangible, an almost living entity that clung to the walls, the floors, and even the very air. Elias descended from the ridge as dusk approached, moving silently through the shadows. He gathered the group near the edge of the woods, each member understanding the unspoken rules: precision, patience, and above all, invisibility. Tonight, he whispered, we escalate, not with violence this time, but with presence. We make them feel watched. Every sound they hear, every shadow they see is our warning. As night fell, lanterns were lit in the manor's windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard. The Hammonds, uneasy, checked doors and shutters multiple times, each check eroding their confidence further. Outside, Elias and his companions positioned themselves strategically, remaining unseen, but always near enough to observe every move. A sudden gust of wind rattled the shutters, and Elijah jumped, spilling a cup of coffee. Lillian gasped, clutching the fabric of her gown, her face pale. From the woods, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper seemed to drift across the yard. A sound so faint that one could convince oneself it was the wind. Yet the effect was immediate. Fear tightened its grip around the Hammonds' hearts, and the once confident man and woman found themselves trembling, trapped in a mansion that felt more like a cage than ever before. Hours passed with no further direct interference, but the psychological campaign continued. Every creak, every whisper of leaves, every movement in the shadows reminded Elijah and Lillian that their authority had been irrevocably compromised. The Hammond's own servants, too frightened to offer any guidance, contributed unknowingly to the mounting tension. Elias signaled the group to withdraw quietly, fading into the night, leaving the Hammonds to stew in their terror. It was a masterclass in patience, strategy, and subtle dominance. The lesson had been reinforced. The slaves held the unseen power, the ability to bend perception and instill fear without raising a single hand in overt violence. As Elijah finally retired to his room, he paused, a glance at the barn door still marked by the memory of his own tongue. The sight sent a chill down his spine. The event of months past, once horrifying, now seemed only the beginning of a slow, inexorable reckoning. Outside, the night continued, and the plantation breathed with a quiet, persistent awareness, a living testament to who truly controlled the land. And for Elias and his companions, the satisfaction was quiet, but absolute. Each step, each minor victory had been earned with meticulous care. Their mastery of fear was complete, their dominance unspoken, yet undeniable. The Hammonds would never see the full extent of it coming. Night had fully descended over the Hammond plantation, and a heavy, suffocating quiet blanketed the grounds. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a night bird, and the subtle drip of water from the roof eaves. Inside the manor, Elijah Hammond paced like a caged animal, his hands trembling as he muttered to himself. Lillian sat rigidly in the parlor, her knitting abandoned, eyes wide and unblinking. Every shadow seemed alive. Every whisper carried intent. Elias and his small contingent of slaves had taken positions along the perimeter of the estate, invisible but omnipresent. Their plan tonight was bold. Psychological dominance had carried them far. But now it was time to escalate. They would strike at the Hammond's sense of security, leaving no doubt who truly held power. From the edge of the woods, Elias surveyed the house, noting each flicker of candlelight through the windows. A subtle signal, a flick of the wrist, passed through the group, and silently they moved into the property. Not one footstep made a sound. The soft mud and moss absorbed every movement. Inside, Elijah paused by the stairwell, sensing a presence he could not place. His gaze darted to the window, catching only a fleeting shadow flit across the pane. His heart thudded painfully. "It's nothing," he whispered to himself, yet the color had drained from his face. Meanwhile, Elias and two others approached the barn. They could see the faint outline of the barn door, where the memory of Elijah's own tongue had been nailed, a permanent warning. They worked with quiet precision, leaving subtle clues that would be discovered at dawn. What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. He recognized the objects, the careful placement. They were not random. Someone had orchestrated this, and he could not see them. Lillian appeared behind him, her breath shallow. She followed his gaze, her eyes catching the faint glow from the smoldering ash. "It's them," she said softly. "They're here, even when we cannot see them." Elias and his team remained outside the windows, watching the reactions, studying the growing fear. The display inside was only part of the plan. The final stage required patience, timing, and a single undeniable act to solidify the lesson. Hours passed, each minute stretching painfully for the Hammonds. Outside, the night whispered secrets through the rustling leaves. The shadows seemed to lengthen, to move with intention, each one a silent herald of the unseen power surrounding the house. At the stroke of midnight, a faint sound, a soft, deliberate tapping began at the windows. Elijah jumped, heart racing as the sound grew louder, a rhythmic beat echoing through the hallways. Lillian clutched his arm, both of them frozen in terror. They knew instinctively that this was no mere trick of the wind. From the darkness outside, Elias signaled his team. One by one, figures emerged, silhouettes against the dim moonlight, each holding a small symbolic token. A broken chain, a tipped chair, a flickering lantern. They remained silent, their presence overwhelming despite the distance. The Hammonds could see them, could feel the power concentrated in the night, yet could not touch them, could not fight back. Elijah's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the realization of how completely they had lost control. Lillian, shaking, pressed close to him, eyes wide with terror and awe. The plantation, the house, and even the very land seemed to hum with the dominance of those who had once labored invisibly under their command. Elias stepped back into the shadows, satisfied. The message had been delivered. The Hammonds would never again feel safe, never again assume power over those they had oppressed. The night belonged to the slaves, to those who had turned fear itself into a weapon. As dawn approached, the figures disappeared as silently as they had arrived. Elijah and Lillian remained on the floor, drained and hollow-eyed. Their house forever changed, haunted by the unseen hands that had orchestrated the perfect act of retribution. The land, the trees, and the very air seemed imbued with a warning. Those who wielded cruelty would always face the reckoning of the invisible, the patient, and the powerful. The Hammond's world had been irrevocably altered, their illusions of control shattered. The night had spoken in whispers and shadows, and it had been heard. Years passed, and the Hammond plantation, once a symbol of power and cruelty, had become a cautionary tale whispered among the nearby towns and the enslaved communities alike. The land itself seemed transformed. The air carried a weight, a subtle tension that reminded every visitor of the night when the balance of fear had shifted irreversibly. Elijah and Lillian were never the same. Their lives were haunted, not only by the memory of that terrifying night, but by the knowledge that they had no true dominion over the very people they had sought to command. The Hammonds tried to maintain appearances in public. Elijah would stroll through the marketplace, his head held high, and Lillian would attend social gatherings, her dresses elegant, her movements refined. Yet behind the facade, every sound, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of a gate, the whisper of wind through the trees, made their hearts race. Servants, strangers, even the land itself seemed to watch them, and they could never quite ignore the sensation that someone, somewhere, was aware of their every action. The former slaves, now free, moved quietly through their lives, carrying with them the stories of that night, the lesson of patience and precision, and the knowledge that power was never truly in the hands of the oppressors. They told their children, their grandchildren, and their neighbors of the night when the Hammonds realized that fear could be wielded as a weapon far more effective than chains or whips. Elias, the architect of the retribution, became a figure of legend. His face was rarely seen, and his name was whispered with both reverence and fear. Stories spread of his uncanny ability to orchestrate events from the shadows, to manipulate even the most cautious and proud of masters without them ever knowing his presence. In truth, he was never far from the plantation, watching, ensuring that the lesson endured and that the Hammonds never again forgot their place. The Hammonds' wealth began to erode slowly at first, then with accelerating momentum. Crops failed inexplicably. Equipment broke without explanation, and workers, once loyal, left in silence, their reasons known only to themselves. The estate that had once been the pinnacle of their pride became a haunted shell. Neighbors avoided it, citing the strange chill in the air and the eerie feeling that the land itself had rejected the family. Some swore they saw flickers of movement near the tree leans, figures emerging and disappearing with the night, but no one could prove what they were. Elijah grew increasingly reclusive, rarely speaking, always jumping at the slightest noise. His nights were sleepless, haunted by shadows and whispers, and he began to age rapidly, his once proud face now lined with anxiety and terror. Lillian, too, withdrew, spending long hours staring out the windows, eyes following unseen movements, hands wringing the fabric of her skirts. She tried to convince herself it was paranoia, but deep down she knew it was more than that. Their punishment had been precise, surgical, and it would not end as long as they carried their arrogance in their hearts. Meanwhile, the community of former slaves thrived. They rebuilt their lives, their families, their traditions. Every harvest, every gathering carried a note of remembrance and a nod to the night when courage, strategy, and patience had turned the tables. They planted trees in memory of those lost, sang songs of warning and empowerment, and passed down the stories so that no master would ever forget. Cruelty invites reckoning, and those underestimated will rise with precision. Decades later, the Hammond plantation had fallen into ruin. The grand house, once the centerpiece of wealth and dominance, had collapsed under the weight of time and neglect. Moss-covered walls leaned at impossible angles. Windows stared blankly into the swampy land, and the air carried a strange, almost sacred silence. Travelers passing by would hear whispers in the trees, soft but insistent, like a memory refusing to fade. And though the humans who had enacted the original retribution had long since passed, their presence lingered. Elias's strategies, Jonas's courage, the meticulous, patient orchestration of fear and justice, it all remained etched into the land itself. The shadows were no longer just darkness. They were guardians, keepers of the truth. That power without justice is temporary and fragile. In the evenings, when the mist rose from the creek and the moon cast pale silver light across the ruins, one could almost see faint silhouettes moving with purpose, figures passing silently between the gnarled trees. Some swore they could hear the soft hum of a harmonica, a song carried through the mist by someone unseen, reminding any who dared trespass that the lessons of the past were alive, unyielding, and eternal. The Hammond's descendants, scattered and diminished, rarely spoke of their lineage, and if they did, it was only in hushed tones, carefully avoiding mention of the events that had forever marked their family's downfall. They lived in quiet anxiety, an inheritance of fear and memory passed down through generations, a legacy that no wealth or property could erase. Meanwhile, the former slaves' community prospered quietly. They cultivated the land with care, educated their children, and preserved the stories. Each tale carried a dual purpose: to honor the courage of those who had acted, and to remind the living that justice, though slow, is inevitable. The Hammond estate, though abandoned and overgrown, remained a constant symbol not of wealth or power, but of the night when the powerless became the arbiters of fate, when fear itself was turned into a shield, a weapon, and a teacher. And in the quietest moments of night, when the wind stirred the branches and the moonlight danced across the creek, one could swear the soft, deliberate notes of a harmonica carried through the mist. It was a reminder that the deeds of the past endure, that courage and patience can outlast cruelty, and that some stories, no matter how horrific or heroic, live forever in the land itself. The Hammond plantation, shrouded in mist, overgrown with weeds and memory, stood as a silent testament. Those who wield oppression as a weapon may rule in the moment, but the reckoning when it comes is patient, deliberate, and inexorably just, and the echoes of that night, the shadows of the unseen, the whispers of those who had suffered and risen, these remained eternal, unbroken, and unwavering. The story of the Hammonds became legend, a tale repeated quietly around fires, in fields, and in homes. A story of courage, retribution, and the enduring power of those who had once been considered powerless. The land remembered, the shadows remembered, and the songs carried on through generations. A haunting, unwavering testament to the truth that justice, once awakened, never sleeps.